The courtroom fell silent as the Navy SEAL stood up. The air was thick with tension. Across the aisle, the cop who had once put him in handcuffs refused to meet his eyes. What followed next was a moment so powerful, so utterly damning, it flipped the entire trial on its head, and left everyone in that courtroom questioning everything they thought they knew about justice. Before we begin today's story, please let us know where you are viewing from. Please remember to subscribe if you like this video. This isn't just another courtroom drama. It's a real-life reckoning between a decorated war hero and a small-town cop with a badge and a bitter secret. One man stood for honor, the other hid behind authority. And when their worlds collided, the truth exploded in front of a packed courtroom. What really happened that night? And how did a Navy SEAL end up defending his own name from behind a defendant's table? It all started on a warm Friday night in July. Retired Navy SEAL Lieutenant Marcus Kane had just returned from a speaking engagement at the local VFW hall. He wasn't in uniform, just a man in jeans and a t-shirt, grabbing a bite at a roadside diner. His service dog, Thor, sat patiently by his side. Marcus had served 16 years, deployed to 3 continents, led teams through unspeakable horrors, and survived. He was headed back to his truck when the flashing lights stopped him cold. Officer Darren Holloway of the Greystone Police Department approached, hand already resting on his holstered weapon. He claimed Marcus fit the description of a burglary suspect, a black man in a gray shirt. Marcus complied calmly, as any trained SEAL would. He offered ID, explained the situation. But Holloway wasn't listening. Within seconds, Marcus was face down on the pavement, Thor barking helplessly as Holloway forced zip-tie cuffs onto Marcus's wrists. Backup arrived, guns drawn. People gathered. Someone filmed it. Marcus was taken in for resisting arrest, assaulting an officer, and obstructing justice. And just like that, a war hero became a criminal in the public eye. The media didn't hesitate. The headlines screamed, "Navy SEAL arrested after confrontation with police." Holloway doubled down, claiming Marcus had lunged and threatened to unleash his dog on him. The department released Holloway's official statement, and the court set a trial date. Marcus didn't care about his reputation. He didn't care about the news. He cared about the lie. Because if Holloway could do this to him, someone trained to be calm under pressure, what chance did a regular black man have? Marcus Kane wasn't raised to fight battles at home. He was raised in Mississippi, where his grandfather once marched with Dr. King. Marcus joined the military to serve a country that hadn't always served him. He believed in honor, in discipline, in sacrifice. The SEALs sharpened those values into steel. He had endured firefights in Kandahar, secret missions in Venezuela, hostage rescues in Somalia. But this accusation, this betrayal, it cut deeper than any wound he'd ever taken in combat. Because it came from within. And it wasn't just about him. It was about every young black man who didn't have the medals, who didn't have the lawyers, who didn't have the platform. Holloway had a history. Marcus's attorney, an old JAG officer named Elena Voss, dug it up. There were 3 other complaints against Holloway for racial profiling. None had stuck. 2 were buried, the other thrown out for lack of evidence. And yet he was still on the force. Elena told Marcus this wasn't just a defense. This was an exposure. "This trial," she said, "is going to be bigger than you. Are you ready for that?" Marcus nodded. "I've walked through fire before." The courtroom was packed on day 4. Everyone from local news to national networks showed up, hungry for a headline. Holloway took the stand in crisp blues, smug confidence radiating from his smile. "I feared for my life," he said. Mr. Kane was aggressive. His dog was barking violently. He made a sudden movement, like he was reaching for something. I had to act. Elena stood, slow and steady. "Let's watch the footage," she said. The room dimmed as the video played. The bystander's clip showed Marcus calm, hands visible. Thor was alert but seated. Holloway raised his voice. Marcus did not. Then, Holloway lunged. Gasps echoed. Even the judge leaned forward. Elena turned. "Mr. Holloway, you stated Mr. Kane lunged. At what timestamp does that occur?" Silence. She continued. "You claim the dog was unleashed. Do you see that happening?" More silence. "Did you know Mr. Kane is a decorated Navy SEAL who suffers from service-related PTSD and requires Thor as a medical support dog?" The silence was deafening now. "Mr. Holloway," she said, stepping closer, "do you typically tackle disabled veterans in parking lots, or did something else about Mr. Kane threaten you?" A crack in Holloway's confidence. Then, Marcus stood. "May I address the court?" The judge hesitated, then nodded. Marcus faced the jury. "I have been shot at by Taliban fighters. I have rescued civilians under sniper fire. I've seen men die in my arms. But nothing shook me like knowing I could do everything right, and still be treated like a threat in my own country. Because of the color of my skin." He paused. "I didn't ask for special treatment. I asked for fairness. I'm not here to destroy Officer Holloway. I'm here to stop a pattern that destroys trust in every good cop out there." The jury was still. The room, stunned. The verdict came in the next day. Not guilty on all charges. The judge ordered an internal investigation into Holloway's conduct. The police chief issued a public apology. Marcus walked out a free man. His name cleared, his dignity intact. But more importantly, something had shifted. Truth had been heard. And justice, for once, had not been blind to it. Marcus didn't sleep much that night. The weight of the courtroom still sat heavy on his chest. He had walked free, yes, but his mind ran circles around what could have happened, what almost did. One wrong move, one twitch misread, and he wouldn't be telling this story at all. As he sat on his porch, Thor resting his massive head on Marcus's boots, the echoes of his final courtroom. Words kept playing back in his head. This wasn't just about clearing his name. It was about every person who never got their day in court. Every brother and sister who didn't have someone filming. Every life that ended on the pavement with no witness, no justice, no closure. The next morning, Elena called. She had received word that Holloway had been placed on administrative leave, pending a formal investigation. "Internal affairs is moving faster than expected," she said. Marcus didn't respond immediately. Instead, he stared out at the horizon, where the sun was breaking through the clouds like a promise. "Good," he finally said. "But it's not enough." Elena knew what he meant. Holloway wasn't the disease, he was a symptom. The real battle wasn't in the courtroom. It was in the systems that protected men like Holloway and buried the voices of those who challenged them. The media had shifted its tone. News anchors now referred to Marcus as a decorated SEAL wrongfully accused. But Marcus didn't want pity or a redemption arc. He wanted truth. So when a local college invited him to speak at a justice reform panel, he accepted. He stood before a room full of students, professors, and community leaders, and he told them exactly what had happened. Not just the arrest. Not just the trial. But the fear. The silence. The years of training that had taught him how to survive combat, yet somehow failed to prepare him for surviving a routine traffic stop while black. The audience was silent. Then a student stood up, tears in her eyes, and asked, "What can we do to change this?" Marcus looked at her for a long time before answering. "Hold the system accountable. Don't just protest, document. Don't just argue, educate. Don't just vote, run. We don't need saviors. We need fighters who understand the battlefield is here, at home, in the courtroom, in the ballot box, in every place where silence has allowed injustice to fester." That talk went viral. And soon, Marcus found himself invited to speak across the state. Sometimes in courtrooms, sometimes in classrooms, sometimes in churches. Each time, he didn't just tell his story. He told theirs. He became a voice not of vengeance, but of vision. Holloway's name slowly faded from the news cycle, but Marcus's didn't. The Department of Justice launched a broader investigation into the Greystone Police Department. 2 other officers quietly resigned. A new chief was brought in, one who, for the first time in the department's history, was a black woman with a background in civil rights litigation. Change was slow, but it was starting. And it started because one man refused to let a lie define him. He could have moved on, changed cities, buried his past in a folder marked pain. But Marcus Kane was a Navy SEAL. He had faced enemies with guns. He wasn't going to back down from a system armed with prejudice. Months later, Marcus was walking through the same parking lot where it had all begun. This time, he wasn't in cuffs. He wasn't afraid. He wasn't alone either. Thor trotted beside him, tail wagging. He passed by the diner and saw a young black man wiping down tables, earbuds in. The kid looked up, eyes widening. "Hey, you're the guy from the video. The SEAL, right?" Marcus nodded. The kid stepped forward, nervous but excited. "My brother showed me that video. I just want you to know, it made me want to study law. I'm applying next year." Marcus smiled. Something rare, something earned. "Good," he said. "We need more of you." And in that moment, Marcus knew, justice isn't just about what happens in a courtroom. It's about what you do when the courtroom is empty. When no one is watching. When the system tries to convince you to be silent. That's when you stand tall. That's when you speak. And that's when real change begins. The weeks that followed brought a whirlwind Marcus had not anticipated. Interviews, feature stories, podcasts, even an invitation to speak at the state capitol. But with each appearance he wasn't chasing fame. He was reclaiming truth. He talked not just about his own experience, but about the deeper rot hiding behind badges and polished PR statements. He began meeting with other veterans who had faced similar injustices, many of them too ashamed or too afraid to speak out. One man, a Marine Corps sergeant, shared how he was tackled outside a grocery store while picking up baby formula because someone thought he looked suspicious. Another, an Army medic, was pulled over and made to sit handcuffed on a curb while his 3-year-old daughter cried in the back seat. Their stories varied, but the thread was the same: trained to serve a country that often didn't protect them in return. Marcus listened, documented, and used every opportunity he had to amplify those voices. With Elena's help, he launched a non-profit called Honor at Home, aimed at protecting veterans of color from unlawful policing and systemic mistreatment. The non-profit offered legal resources, advocacy training, and partnered with civil rights organizations to push for local and state-level reforms. Donations poured in. But it wasn't just the support that stunned Marcus, it was the resistance. Anonymous emails. Social media threats. One letter, and signed and smeared with something that smelled like motor oil, read, "You might have won one battle, but the war's just begun." Marcus handed it to local authorities, but he didn't flinch. He had faced real enemies. Cowards with pens didn't scare him. What did keep him up at night was the slow realization that for every person supporting his mission, there was another who believed Holloway had done nothing wrong. They clung to the idea that Marcus must have done something, despite the footage, despite the ruling, despite the facts. That belief wasn't just ignorance, it was willful blindness. Still, Marcus pressed forward. He began visiting police academies, holding workshops on implicit bias, and training officers on how to engage with veterans, especially those with service dogs or PTSD. Some welcomed him. Others rolled their eyes, arms crossed and minds closed. But Marcus didn't need them all to listen. He just needed a few to care. And slowly, some did. One young recruit approached him after a workshop and said, "I joined the force to protect people, but I didn't realize I might be a danger to someone like you. Thank you for opening my eyes." Marcus nodded, his face unreadable but heart moved. He had seen too much to believe in miracles, but he believed in momentum. One night back at home, Marcus sat with Elena on the porch. They were quiet for a long time, watching fireflies dance across the yard. Then Elena said, "You realize what you've done, right?" Marcus chuckled. "Got tackled by a racist cop and lived to tell about it?" She smiled, shaking her head. "You turned one lie into a lighthouse. People are watching now. People are learning." Marcus stared ahead, thoughtful. "I just wanted to clear my name." Elena replied, "You did more than that. You gave people a reason to fight." They sat in silence again. Thor shifted at Marcus's feet, letting out a soft sigh. Somewhere in the distance, sirens wailed. Not threatening, just background noise now. In the months that followed, the Greystone Police Department underwent its first major internal audit in 2 decades. New policies were implemented. Body camera footage became mandatory for all stops. Officers with repeat complaints were subjected to mandatory review boards. Holloway's case was closed, but his badge was permanently revoked. He disappeared from public life, quietly severed from the department that once protected him. Marcus didn't celebrate. This wasn't about vengeance. It was about setting a new standard. One that didn't excuse fear as an acceptable response to black skin. One that didn't allow a uniform to shield abuse. One that demanded more from those who claimed to serve. When Marcus was later awarded the state's Medal of Civil Contribution, an honor given for extraordinary community impact, he almost declined. "I didn't do this for awards," he told the committee. "I did it because I didn't have a choice." But Elena nudged him. "Accept it. Not for you, for every man who can't." So Marcus stood on that stage, holding a medal that weighed less than his burden, but symbolized something far greater. Not redemption, not validation, but hope. Quiet, steady, powerful hope. Afterward, as reporters shouted questions, one young journalist asked, "If you could go back and erase that night with Officer Holloway, would you?" Marcus thought for a long moment before answering. "No," he said, "because that night forced me to choose between silence and truth. And once you choose truth, you can't go back." The days began to flow into one another, marked not by calm, but by a relentless surge of requests, interviews, and strategy meetings. Marcus barely had time to process the journey he had been thrust into, but every time he considered slowing down, a new letter would arrive. Some were from veterans, others from mothers whose sons were stopped, harassed, or worse. One envelope contained a photo of a boy no older than 16 with a bullet wound in his back, accompanied by a handwritten note. "He wanted to be a Navy SEAL like you." That night, Marcus sat on the floor of his living room. Photos, papers, and case files spread around him like a battlefield. Thor curled at his side, sensing the weight of the memories pressing down. Elena found him there, eyes scanning story after story, his jaw tight. "I can't fix it all," he muttered, voice raw. Elena knelt beside him and whispered, "But you're making them harder to ignore." And she was right. The nonprofit's hotline had received over 2,000 calls in 2 months. Marcus didn't sleep more than 4 hours a night, fueled not by anger, but by duty. The kind of duty no uniform could enforce. He began testifying at hearings, pushing for bills that would require independent review boards for any incident involving use of force against veterans. One proposal, dubbed Kane's Code, called for a federal veteran verification system accessible by law enforcement to prevent wrongful assumptions about behavior due to trauma-related disabilities. Opponents argued it would compromise police discretion. Marcus fired back publicly. "Discretion without accountability is a recipe for disaster. I've seen what it costs." His reputation grew, not just as a wronged man turned advocate, but as someone who could not be bought, silenced, or swayed. Political groups tried to co-opt his story, spinning it into narratives that fit their agenda. He rejected them all. "This isn't a left or right issue," he said on national TV. "It's a human one." That clarity earned him respect in unlikely places. A retired police chief from another state reached out privately and offered to help train departments using Marcus's approach. "I got into this job to protect people," the man said. "Somewhere along the way we forgot how." Marcus agreed to work with him, and soon, they began developing a national training program for veteran-sensitive policing, integrating both de-escalation and trauma-informed communication. Meanwhile, Holloway's name surfaced again. not in defense, but as a case study in every law school ethics class examining abuse of power. The irony wasn't lost on Marcus. He never set out to destroy the man, but in the end, Holloway had undone himself. One day, after speaking at a civil liberties conference, Marcus received a message from someone unexpected. Holloway's former partner, Officer Renee Whitman. She asked for a meeting, and though Marcus was reluctant, he agreed. They met in a quiet cafe just outside Greystone. Renee looked different. Tired, thinner, her eyes worn. "I left the force 6 weeks ago," she began. "It was eating at me. What happened that night? I knew it was wrong. But I froze. I didn't stop him. I didn't speak up. And I've hated myself for it." Marcus stared at her, expression unreadable. "So why now?" he asked. She swallowed hard. "Because silence made me complicit. I wanted to apologize in person." Marcus didn't offer comfort, but he nodded. "Apology accepted," he said, then added, "Use your voice now. It's not too late to start telling the truth." Renee promised she would, and months later, she began working with Honor at Home as an advisor on police reform. Her testimony added weight to Marcus's advocacy, showing the system's problems weren't just about individuals, but culture, inertia, and fear. As the nonprofit expanded nationally, Marcus stepped into the role of executive director, appointing a new leadership team to manage operations while he continued field work and public speaking. He visited schools, ran workshops with veteran support groups, and even trained state troopers in Texas. At each stop, he carried with him not just his own story, but the hundreds he had absorbed along the way. When asked how he kept going, he'd simply say, "Because someone has to." Late one evening, as Marcus reviewed footage for an upcoming awareness campaign, he came across a video submission from a young black veteran named Jalen. In it, Jalen detailed his own stop-and-frisk experience, how it had triggered a panic attack rooted in his deployment to Afghanistan. The officer had laughed, mocked his reactions, and never even ran his ID. Jalen ended with, "I thought serving meant respect. Turns out, some people only see skin, not service." Marcus sat still for a long moment. Then he turned to Elena, who had just walked into the room, and said quietly, "We're just getting started." The momentum Marcus had generated didn't just ripple across his state. It surged across the entire country, sparking uncomfortable conversations in precincts, government chambers, and community forums nationwide. Yet with that surge came scrutiny, criticism, and backlash from entrenched institutions and individuals threatened by change. And as Marcus flew from city to city, appearing on talk shows, addressing police commissions, and meeting with legislators, he was met with both applause and scorn. Hailed as a hero by some and a troublemaker by others, but none of it compared to what he faced during a hearing on Capitol Hill where he was called to testify before the Senate Subcommittee on Law Enforcement Oversight, the room packed with press, politicians, and policy wonks, some eager to listen, others looking for a crack in his armor. But Marcus, composed as ever, recounted the events of his assault. The lies Officer Holloway spewed, the court's vindication, and the institutional silence that followed. Then he pivoted seamlessly into statistics, patterns, and lived stories, not just his own but those of hundreds of veterans of color who had contacted his nonprofit seeking help, their narratives shockingly similar. Misidentification, over-policing, escalation rather than de-escalation, and above all, the erasure of their service, their humanity, and their rights. His voice unwavering as he ended with a pointed question that echoed through the chamber. How can we ask our citizens to serve their country abroad if we cannot guarantee their dignity at home? And that line became the soundbite of the week, played across every news outlet and social media platform, a piercing indictment not only of systemic racism in policing but of national hypocrisy. And yet, while progressives praised him, conservatives on the committee pushed back, suggesting he was painting law enforcement with too broad a brush, to which Marcus responded, "If I was describing water leaking through a boat, I wouldn't say a few holes, I'd say the boat is compromised, because it is, And even those who didn't agree with his framing couldn't argue with his delivery, his precision, his credibility. He wasn't an angry protester or a detached academic. He was a war hero with medals on his chest and scars on his back, and that made him harder to dismiss, even by those desperate to discredit him. Meanwhile, back home in Greystone, things were changing slowly, but changing nonetheless. The new interim police chief, a soft-spoken but sharp-minded woman named Marisol Quinn, had initiated the most comprehensive departmental overhaul in decades, requiring officers to undergo monthly community engagement training, implementing third-party reviews of excessive force incidents, and working directly with Honor at Home to educate officers on veteran trauma. But there was resistance from within, and one night a brick was thrown through the nonprofit's window with a note attached that read, "Betrayer of Brothers," and Marcus stood in the broken glass, reading it silently, before sweeping it up himself, never flinching, just more resolved. Meanwhile, Officer Holloway, now stripped of title, pension, and public backing, sued for defamation, claiming his reputation had been unfairly destroyed. But the case was laughed out of court, especially when Marcus's legal team presented additional footage from Holloway's body cam archives that showed a disturbing pattern of behavior. Several cases that had quietly been closed were reopened, and soon Holloway wasn't just disgraced. He was indicted on 3 counts of misconduct under color of law, and while he awaited trial, Marcus focused on the mission, meeting with military bases across the country to roll out Operation Respect, a program built to bridge the cultural divide between veterans and local law enforcement through cross-training, seminars, and mutual accountability. And he wasn't alone by now. A dozen regional chapters of Honor at Home had sprouted, run by veterans who had found new purpose in Marcus's movement, including Jalen, who had gone from a soft-spoken whistleblower to the face of the nonprofit's West Coast division, and watching him lead his own press conference in Oakland, Marcus felt a quiet pride. Not the loud kind reserved for parades or salutes, but the kind that came from knowing someone you lifted had learned to lift others. Still, Marcus was tired, and as year 2 of the movement began, he faced burnout. His therapist gently warning him during a late-night Zoom session, even warriors need rest. But how could he rest when there was more to do, more stories coming in each day, more rallies to attend, more bills to push? And so he pressed on, until one night during a conference in Atlanta, his body finally gave out. He collapsed from exhaustion backstage and woke up in a hospital, Elena sitting beside him with tears in her eyes. "You're not invincible, Marcus," she said softly. "You don't have to carry all of this alone." And in that quiet room he finally allowed himself to exhale, to cry, to be vulnerable, and he promised her he'd delegate more, take real breaks, focus not just on the fight but on living. And so he adjusted. He appointed regional directors, reduced his public appearances, and took a sabbatical from speaking engagements, using the time to write a book chronicling everything from his Navy SEAL deployments to the moment Officer Holloway put him on the ground. The book, titled Silent Valor, The Fight for Honor at Home, became an instant bestseller, not because it was a thrilling war memoir or an incendiary exposé, but because it was raw, thoughtful, and deeply human, and the stories inside weren't just his, they were everyone's. And one chapter in particular, titled The Uniform Beneath the Skin, became required reading at multiple police academies and college sociology courses. Meanwhile, Holloway's trial proceeded. The courtroom quieter this time, fewer cameras, but the impact was just as sharp. The prosecution painted a picture not just of an abusive cop, but of a man emboldened by a system that refused to check him. And the jury, diverse and deliberate, found him guilty on all counts, sentencing him to 8 years in federal prison. Marcus didn't attend the sentencing. He didn't need to. Justice had spoken. But more importantly, reform had taken root, and as the years passed, the nonprofit grew into one of the most respected veteran advocacy organizations in the country, winning awards, securing partnerships with the VA, and even influencing presidential candidates' policy platforms. And through it all, Marcus remained its compass, even if from a quieter role, occasionally returning to the spotlight when it mattered most, like the night he appeared unannounced at a candlelight vigil for a black Air Force pilot wrongfully killed by police in another state, standing silently in the back, then stepping forward to deliver one sentence that cut through grief like a prayer. "We remember because silence buries truth." and then stepping back into the crowd, letting the community take the mic, empowering others to lead, because that was the lesson he'd learned. Not to be the voice, but to awaken them in others. And years later, when a national documentary aired chronicling his journey, critics called it the story that sparked a movement, while veterans called it our truth finally told. And in the final scene, Marcus sat on his porch once again, Thor older now, eyes clouded but loyal as ever. And Elena beside him, their children playing in the yard. And when asked by the documentarian what he hoped people remembered about him, Marcus paused, looked out at the sunset and said simply, that I didn't let the lie win, because for him it was never about revenge, it was about reclaiming truth, restoring honor, and ensuring that no man who served his country would ever again have to prove his humanity once he returned home. The years that followed Marcus Kane's national rise saw the institutional landscape shift in ways no one had predicted, because his confrontation with injustice had become more than a personal reckoning. It had turned into a blueprint for systemic reform across the nation. And while Marcus never sought fame, his story continued to appear in law school lectures, veteran care seminars, and diversity training slideshows in precincts that once refused to acknowledge the very problems he exposed. And despite his semi-retirement from public appearances, his influence was more present than ever as young leaders inspired by his bravery stepped into the arena, picking up the torch with clarity and conviction, like Alexis Martinez, a former Marine turned civil rights attorney who had once been stopped at gunpoint while carrying his deployment gear through a suburban neighborhood. He joined Honor at Home as its chief legal strategist, creating a robust litigation wing that helped wronged veterans file claims, win settlements, and challenge unconstitutional policing in federal courts. And then there was Diana Okoye, a Nigerian-American Air Force medic who survived an unlawful raid in her apartment, who later became the organization's lead policy analyst and was instrumental in drafting the Kane Federal Standards Act, a sweeping bill mandating trauma-informed policing protocols, racial bias audits, and an independent ombudsman for all interactions involving veterans and law enforcement at the federal level. And though the bill faced early resistance, the relentless testimony from victims and families, combined with mounting public support and bipartisan pressure, led to its historic passage on Veterans Day 5 years after Marcus's trial. And the day the president signed it into law, Marcus received a phone call not from a journalist or politician, but from Jalen, now a father himself, who simply said, "We did it, brother. Your fight saved my boy's future." And that quiet acknowledgement meant more to Marcus than any medal or headline ever could, because while legislation changed systems, healing happened one life at a time, one story given the dignity it was long denied, and yet the work never truly ended. New cases arose, new injustices surfaced, and new enemies emerged, particularly from factions that labeled Marcus and his movement as anti-cop, deliberately ignoring that dozens of police departments had adopted Honor at Home training models and seen dramatic drops in use of force complaints. But Marcus, seasoned and focused, never took the bait, always reiterating his message. Accountability isn't anti-law enforcement. It's the only way to restore trust between officers and the communities they swore to protect. And it was this consistent, unshakable clarity that kept his legacy not only alive but expanding. So much so that major universities began creating scholarship funds in his name for children of veterans affected by police violence, while a national day of recognition was proposed, Veterans Justice Day, to honor those who wore the uniform abroad and deserved fairness at home. And as his children grew older, they began to understand the magnitude of their father's sacrifice. Though Marcus shielded them from much of the darker details, he often told them bedtime stories not about war or courtrooms, but about courage, about standing when others shrink, about knowing right from wrong and choosing right even when it costs you everything. And one evening, his daughter asked him, "Daddy, were you scared when that police officer hurt you?" And Marcus paused before answering, "Yes, baby, I was scared, but being brave doesn't mean you're not afraid, it means you keep going anyway." And she nodded, her tiny hands wrapping around his, and in that moment Marcus knew his greatest legacy wasn't legislation or movements or headlines. It was the example he set in his own home, the seeds of resilience he planted in his children's hearts. And those seeds bloomed in ways he hadn't anticipated, especially when his son, Isaiah, joined ROTC and later the Navy, not because of pressure but because he believed in service, in honor, in the kind of quiet strength his father embodied. And during Isaiah's commissioning ceremony, Marcus stood at attention, tears in his eyes, saluting his boy with a pride that transcended words, and afterward, when reporters asked him what the moment meant, he replied, "It means the cycle is broken. He serves because he wants to, not because he's trying to prove anything to a world that questioned his father's worth." And that sentiment captured the essence of Marcus's journey. From wrongful arrest to global reform, from betrayal by a badge to redemption through action. Yet despite the monumental victories, Marcus never allowed himself to become complacent because he knew how easily systems regressed when no one was watching. And so even in his later years, he continued mentoring younger veterans, reviewing policy proposals, and occasionally appearing at high schools and community centers to speak to teenagers, especially young black boys, about how to navigate a world that sometimes failed to see their full humanity. And each time he ended those talks with the same words, "You are not dangerous. You are not disposable. You are not the threat. They just don't know your story yet." And after those sessions, young men would line up just to shake his hand, take a picture, or simply say, "Thank you." And for Marcus, those were the real courtrooms, the places where truth faced lies, dignity faced ignorance, and hope stood trial every single day. And long after headlines faded and political winds changed, his story remained a North Star for those lost in the storm of systemic injustice. And one day, during a global veteran summit in Geneva, Marcus delivered what would become his final public speech. Standing before world leaders, diplomats, and service members from across the globe, he spoke not of awards or institutions but of a single moment, being slammed to the ground by the very man sworn to protect him, and the silence that followed, then the courtroom, the confrontation, and the victory not of ego but of truth. And he ended with this: "The uniform doesn't grant you dignity, it reveals it. And the badge doesn't make you honorable, it tests whether you are." And that quote was etched into the Summit Hall's memorial wall, a permanent reminder of the man who turned trauma into transformation, betrayal into blueprint, pain into purpose. And though Marcus eventually passed in his sleep surrounded by family, his legacy was not buried. It was inherited, carried forward by a movement that refused to die. And at his funeral, veterans, officers, politicians, and civilians all stood together, hands on hearts, saluting not just the man, but the message he lived. That honor must exist on both sides of the badge, and that truth, once spoken, cannot be silenced. And as the final hymn played and Thor, aged and quiet, lay beside the casket, thousands lit candles across the country, each flame a promise to continue the work, to tell the stories, to confront the lies, because in the end, Marcus Kane had exposed more than a corrupt cop. He had exposed a nation's blind spot and forced it to see, to listen, to change, and for that, history would never forget his name. In the weeks that followed Marcus Kane's funeral, the ripple effects of his life's work became even more visible, not through grand ceremonies or flashy tributes, but in the quiet changes that spread across the country. Departments that once dismissed the Honor at Home initiative began adopting it with urgency. Cities previously resistant to oversight now openly embraced external review boards. And young officers entering the force cited Marcus's story as their moral compass during training, noting how his courtroom showdown had taught them that integrity mattered more than loyalty to flawed systems. And in living rooms across America, families watched reruns of that pivotal trial, where a Navy SEAL stood toe-to-toe with a lying officer and calmly dismantled a mountain of falsehoods with nothing but facts, honor, and an unshakable voice. And in that trial's aftermath, people had come to understand that Marcus was never just fighting for himself. He was fighting for every silent veteran, every wrongly profiled citizen, every parent who had to coach their child on how to survive a traffic stop. And as years passed, Marcus's children carried on his mission in their own unique ways. Isaiah, now a decorated Navy intelligence officer, worked to reform internal culture by implementing unconscious bias training within special ops units, and his sister Layla launched an education nonprofit teaching students about civil liberties, history, and the cost of silence, often beginning her classroom visits with stories of her father's resilience, painting a vivid picture of the man who never chose comfort over truth, who faced the storm head-on so his children wouldn't have to, and meanwhile, Marcus's wife, Dahlia, after years of quiet support, finally took the spotlight herself, releasing a memoir titled The Strength Beside the Soldier, which detailed their journey from deployment to courtroom chaos and ultimately to healing, and the book quickly became a bestseller, resonating with military spouses and civilians alike who saw in her story the invisible burden carried by those who stand in the shadow of public battles. And while the public hailed Marcus as a hero, those closest to him always remembered his humility, how he insisted on mowing his own lawn even when senators came to visit, how he stayed up late answering emails from struggling veterans who just wanted someone to understand, how he told his kids bedtime stories not about war or glory but about forgiveness, about second chances, and about why doing the right thing often came at the highest cost. And as time wore on, memorials were built in his honor. A bronze statue outside the courthouse where he faced down lies, a scholarship fund in his name at Annapolis, even a community center in his old neighborhood, where young boys who once feared the badge now came to learn coding, boxing, and debate. And through every one of these tributes, Marcus's legacy lived not in stone, but in action, not in memory but in movement. And on the 10th anniversary of his landmark trial, a nationwide event known as Cane Day was observed, where schools, precincts, and community groups held conversations about race, justice, and accountability, using Marcus's story as the central case study. And among the most powerful moments that day was a televised panel featuring Officer Kyle Stanton, the man whose lies had once nearly destroyed Marcus's life, who had since been released from prison, gone through restorative justice programs, and now spoke openly about the culture of silence and entitlement that had shaped his decisions. And with eyes lowered, voice cracking, Stanton said, "I was trained to see threats, not people. I was wrong, and Marcus paid the price for it." And while some questioned the platform given to a disgraced cop, others saw it as a final testament to Marcus's power. That even his adversary had been transformed by the truth he dared to speak aloud. And so, in auditoriums, classrooms, and homes that day, people watched Marcus's testimony once again, heard the calm in his voice, saw the tears he never tried to hide, and felt the weight of what it meant to demand dignity from a system designed to deny it. And by evening, candlelight vigils were held in over 30 states, with one common phrase repeated like a prayer: "Truth doesn't tremble." And in the glow of those lights, in the voices of children reciting his name, in the tears of veterans who no longer felt invisible, Marcus Cane's story found its final form, not just as a courtroom victory, but as a movement, a mirror, and a message that would never again be ignored. The years passed, but the fire that Marcus Cane lit never dimmed, spreading far beyond the walls of that courtroom and echoing through policy chambers, police academies, and grassroots communities across the country. And though the headlines faded and the world moved on to new controversies, the ripple effects of his trial remained embedded in the soul of the nation, sparking reforms that would have once seemed impossible, like the establishment of the National Law Enforcement Integrity Tribunal, a civilian-led body with oversight authority over officer conduct in all 50 states, modeled after Marcus's vision of fairness and accountability. And while politicians tried to claim credit and agencies scrambled to catch up, those who had truly walked alongside Marcus knew this transformation was the result of a man who refused to betray his own moral compass, who faced falsehood not with fury but with facts. And as that tribunal began reviewing decades of unchecked abuse, reopening long-forgotten cases, and issuing formal apologies to families once silenced, a cultural reckoning followed, bringing both pain and progress, with retired officers coming forward in droves to admit their complicity, with some testifying in Congress about the toxic environments they'd once called brotherhood, their stories echoing Marcus's warnings about misplaced loyalty. And in schools, young students now learned about the Cane confrontation not just as a legal milestone but as a moral turning point, a moment when the nation looked in the mirror and for once didn't look away. And in the wake of this awakening, artists, filmmakers, and musicians paid tribute to Marcus's legacy in their own mediums. A Broadway play titled The Seal and the Badge toured internationally, A jazz album called Testify sampled audio from the trial and layered it with aching horn solos, and a critically acclaimed documentary, Honor in the Crosshairs, won an Emmy for its brutal and honest portrayal of systemic betrayal and redemption. And through it all, the Kane family remained grounded, never chasing the spotlight but always showing up where it mattered, at community town halls, legal clinics for veterans, and youth mentorship programs, where Marcus's widow, Dahlia, became a powerful speaker in her own right, traveling to underserved towns and reminding young people, especially black and brown youth, that their voices mattered even when the world tried to mute them. And meanwhile Isaiah continued to climb through military ranks, becoming the youngest lieutenant commander in his unit's history, and leading a task force focused on ethical operations and cross-cultural sensitivity. While Layla's nonprofit had grown into a multi-state institution with its own publishing house and civic leadership boot camps, and as her organization trained the next generation of advocates, judges, and policymakers, she often quoted her father, "The truth won't speak for itself, you've got to give it your voice." And that mantra, passed down like scripture, lived in every corner of her work, just as Marcus's legacy lived in every piece of legislation passed under the Kane Reform banner, which now included 10 major laws on police conduct, psychological evaluations, racial bias training, body cam regulations, and veteran protections, each one a brick in the bridge toward justice that Marcus had started to build with nothing but a voice and a spine. And yet, even with such progress, the struggle was not over. As new incidents of abuse emerged, new names filled protest signs, and old resistances returned in waves, reminding everyone that the fight for dignity was ongoing. But those moments didn't spark despair anymore. They sparked memory, resolve, and the question, what would Marcus do? Which had become a guiding principle among activists and community leaders, who studied his trial transcripts like sacred texts, not just for what he said, but for how he said it, with clarity, compassion, and unshakable resolve. And in those transcripts, especially the moment he calmly looked into the eyes of his accuser and said, "You're not just lying about me, officer. You're lying about the values your badge claims to protect." Students and reformers alike found the courage to confront their own systems, their own silences, their own complicity, and in that way, Marcus continued to mentor people he'd never meet, shaping minds that would one day sit on city councils, lead investigations, teach in public schools, and run for office. And even globally, Marcus's name became a symbol of ethical courage, with human rights coalitions in South America, South Africa, and Southeast Asia citing his case as precedent when pushing for their own police reforms. And at the United Nations, his name was etched into a special resolution honoring defenders of civil dignity, and every November 3rd, the date of his testimony, was now observed in multiple countries as International Integrity Day, a quiet but powerful reflection of one man's ability to ignite global change. And yet, for those closest to him, the impact was felt in more personal, quieter ways, like the young veteran in Houston who once told a support group, "I nearly ended my life until I saw Kane stand up to that cop. I realized my voice mattered too." Or the mother in Detroit who named her newborn Marcus after hearing his story on a late-night podcast. Or the police cadet in Philadelphia who carried a quote from the Kane trial in his vest pocket, reading it before every shift. Justice without courage is just convenience. And even former detractors, people who had once scoffed at his defiance or dismissed his claims, began to quietly admit that he had been right, not just about the misconduct but about the cost of silence. And so in town halls and precincts and campuses across the country, the conversation had changed, no longer fixated on whether systemic injustice existed, but focused instead on how to dismantle it, how to replace it with something rooted in empathy and equity. And though the fight continued and always would, the movement now had a spine forged in the fires of Kane's courtroom. And that spine gave strength to movements like Truth in Uniform, Shield and Soul, and March to Remember, grassroots coalitions that fought not just for accountability but for reconciliation, insisting that justice could coexist with healing, that those who had been harmed could become part of the solution, that Marcus Kane's story was not a weapon but a light, and that light now burned in the hearts of thousands who carried forward his mission not out of obligation but out of love. Because love was what drove Marcus all along. Love for his country, his family, the oath he took, and the people his voice now protected from beyond the grave. And in a world full of noise, outrage, and distraction, Marcus Cain's life was a testament to the enduring power of quiet, unflinching truth. And so it was that on a humid July morning, 12 years to the day since Marcus Cain had stood in that now famous courtroom and faced down the lies that nearly buried him, a new chapter unfolded, not in a courthouse or on a battlefield, but in the quiet hum of a modest auditorium in Atlanta, Georgia, where a group of young recruits, new police cadets, military hopefuls, social work students, and law interns, gathered in folding chairs to watch an unreleased archival video of Marcus's full cross examination, now digitized and restored in high definition, every breath and blink preserved in haunting clarity, and the room sat in stunned silence as Marcus dismantled false narratives with the precision of a surgeon, not flinching when accused, not wavering when baited, simply holding the line of truth with the patience of a man who had faced much worse than a bitter officer's scorn. And as the screen faded to black, the instructor, an Army veteran named Charlene Walker, who had once served alongside Marcus, stepped forward with tears in her eyes and asked, "What do you owe the truth?" And the cadets, most barely 21, some fresh off the streets where they'd been targeted themselves, others raised in families where law enforcement was generational, all sat frozen, unsure how to respond, until one young man in the front, a first-generation college student named Ronaldo, whispered, "Everything," and that word echoed in the stillness like scripture. Not just because it was the right answer, but because it was the lived truth of every person in that room. And it was then that Charlene handed out small, square black cards embossed in silver, each bearing one sentence from Marcus's testimony. A badge should never shield a lie, and instructed them to carry it with them every day of their training, not as a symbol of guilt but of promise. And as those students left that auditorium and moved forward into their own careers, they did so with that promise in their pocket, in their memory, in their bones. And they were not alone, for across the country, in spaces once hostile to reform, Marcus's name had become shorthand for conscience, and his story was now required reading in dozens of academies, legal ethics courses, and trauma response workshops, with entire modules dedicated to breaking down the Cain case from multiple angles. Legal, psychological, moral, sociological, all intersecting at one central point, that when confronted with cruelty dressed as law, Marcus Cain refused to comply, and in refusing, he did not become bitter, did not become vengeful, but became something far rarer, a healer who used truth as his scalpel and clarity as his suture, and that model reshaped how law was taught and practiced, with prosecutors citing Cain versus Stanton as a watershed case, judges referencing it in bench memorandums, and civil liberties groups building litigation strategies around its precedents. But beyond policy and precedent, the story had also burrowed deep into culture, inspiring graphic novels, virtual reality reconstructions, even a critically acclaimed video game titled Standpoint that placed players in Marcus's shoes and tasked them with navigating the trial not through violence or evasion, but through logic, empathy, and resilience. And as generations of gamers played that story, they found themselves not only entertained but educated, emerging with a new understanding of what it meant to confront injustice without becoming it. And on forums and social media, young players wrote things like, "I didn't know courtrooms could be war zones," and "I want to be someone who speaks like Cain," and "he made me believe again." And those sentiments, raw and real, fed into the broader shift that had been quietly occurring for over a decade, a shift in public expectation. Not just demanding justice but understanding its cost, not just vilifying corruption but cultivating courage. And that courage was now institutionalized in spaces once allergic to vulnerability, like the reformed police integrity units that Marcus had advocated for, which now included licensed trauma counselors on staff, mandatory racial equity audits, and rotating citizen panels made up of diverse community members with veto power over departmental policies. And while cynics claimed these changes were cosmetic or slow, those on the ground knew the difference, because when an officer now stood trial for misconduct, Marcus Cain's name was evoked not as martyrdom but as mandate. And the pressure of that expectation, of being measured against the gold standard of truth, changed how cases were handled, how victims were treated, how transparency was prioritized, and perhaps more importantly, how shame was repurposed, not as a tool of fear but of growth. For even former abusers who came forward to admit their past wrongs did so under the Cain Amnesty Clause, a policy Marcus proposed but never lived to see passed. which allowed lower-level officers to receive reduced penalties if they provided full cooperation in systemic investigations and participated in community healing programs, and while controversial, this clause led to over 600 officers testifying in open court about entrenched corruption, many of whom credited Marcus's story as the reason they found the strength to come clean. And so in countless cities, some once plagued by silence and fear, the truth began to bloom like a stubborn flower cracking through concrete, and though Marcus himself was gone, his words remained alive, not just in books or broadcasts but in the mouths of children reciting school pledges, in the speeches of mayors opening reformed precincts, in the hearts of jurors deliberating with new awareness, and even in the whispered prayers of mothers whose sons now came home safe. And as the 12th anniversary of his testimony came to a close, a massive digital mosaic went live online, titled simply The Witness. Composed of over 40,000 user-submitted portraits of people holding signs with their answer to the question, "What do you owe? The truth?" And as the camera zoomed out, Marcus's face emerged from the patchwork, his eyes looking out not with judgment, but with peace, as if to say, "You listened." And that night, in cities around the world, people gathered, not in anger, not in protest, but in quiet solidarity, lighting candles not just for Marcus, but for the world he had envisioned, one where truth no longer trembled and where a single voice, steady and unyielding, could turn even the most corrupted silence into something brave, something holy, something eternal. And in the stillness of that final vigil, as thousands gathered in public squares and church basements and dorm hallways and prison yards and police stations and family kitchens, the legacy of Marcus Kane crystallized not as a singular event but as a living doctrine, a blueprint etched into the conscience of a changing nation that could no longer pretend blindness, no longer afford neutrality. And in that moment of collective memory, those who had once doubted now bore witness, those who had once resisted now reconciled, and those who had once stood alone now stood together, because Marcus had done more than expose a corrupt officer. He had exposed the rot beneath the uniform, the silence that enabled injustice, the cowardice that hid behind policy, and through his unwavering stand he showed what it truly meant to serve, to defend not just borders or flags but the soul of the nation. And across the globe, in embassies and military installations and refugee camps and classrooms, his story became required study, his tactics examined like sacred martial arts, his principles translated into over 60 languages, his final courtroom exchange recreated in global theater productions. And as the years rolled forward and Marcus's children grew older, they did not retreat into legacy, they activated it, becoming leaders not just in name but in vision. Isaiah now overseeing global veteran mental health reforms at the United Nations, where he often quoted his father in peacekeeping speeches, "A uniform should never cost you your humanity." And Layla now a published author of 2 best-selling books on restorative justice and the architect behind the Kane Center for Transformative Accountability, which trained over 20,000 leaders a year in principles of moral clarity and social repair. And yet for all the accolades and advances, the Kane family remained humble, often turning down interviews and awards, choosing instead to show up in everyday spaces, school visits, prison literacy programs, housing rights coalitions, survivor support circles, because that's what Marcus would have done, not chase the spotlight but carry the lantern forward. And perhaps most moving of all was the silent procession held every year in Washington, D.C., where thousands marched not with chants or slogans but in absolute quiet, each carrying a candle and a card bearing Marcus's words. And each year, the march ended at the steps of the courthouse where it all began, where a plaque now stood in his honor, inscribed not with his military rank or trial verdict but with a single line, "He spoke truth to power and never flinched." And each year, veterans came forward with stories of how they'd once hidden their trauma, their fear, their questions, but Marcus's courage gave them permission to unburden, to heal, to live fully again. And each year, more police departments sent delegations to learn, to listen, to reform. And while skeptics always remained, while pushback never disappeared, the balance had shifted. Integrity was no longer optional, silence was no longer safety, and truth, once suppressed, now had guardians in every profession, every zip code, every walk of life. And in private moments, those closest to Marcus often recalled not his most famous speech or his courtroom victory, but the quiet things, the way he held the door for strangers, the way he studied the Constitution like a sacred text, the way he wrote thank you notes to rookies who did their job with dignity, the way he once told his son, "Courage isn't loud, son, it's consistent." And those small truths now guided a new generation. And even as new scandals emerged, new lies threatened to undo progress, the Kane Doctrine stood like an immovable pillar in the justice system, reminding all who entered its halls that accountability was not a punishment but a promise. And in courtrooms bearing his name, lawyers now trained under his model, judges used the Kane Integrity Index in sentencing, and officers were taught from day one that authority without ethics was a loaded weapon pointed inward. And in Marcus's hometown, the same police department that once turned its back on him now ran the Kane Fellowship, a paid internship for at-risk youth to study criminal justice and help reshape the very systems that had once crushed them. And graduates of that program now sat in city councils, sat on oversight boards, wore the badge differently, proudly, because it meant something again, and when asked why they joined, many pointed to a framed photo hanging in the hallway. Marcus Kane, standing alone in the courtroom, gaze steady, jaw set, dignity unbroken. And they would say, because he stood for us before we could stand for ourselves. And so the story continued, not as a closed chapter but as a living force. And even as Marcus's grandchildren grew up and began asking questions, who was Papa? They were handed not just tales of heroism but recordings, transcripts, letters from strangers he had saved unknowingly, and in their eyes, the legend of Kane was not myth but manual, a guide on how to live with honor in a world addicted to compromise. And so the final truth was this: Marcus Kane did not just win a trial, he rewrote the rules of the courtroom, reframed what valor looked like, and restored faith in institutions, not by tearing them down, but by calling them up. And though time would move on, and new names would emerge, and history would unfold in new battles, new betrayals and new reckonings, the name Marcus Kane would remain etched in memory, not as the man who fought the system, but as the man who revealed its soul, and demanded that it be worthy of the people it claimed to serve. What do you think? Was justice truly served? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. And if you want to hear another story that exposes the cracks in our justice system, check out our next video. Wrongfully convicted teen outsmarts prosecutor in stunning twist.